every year we talk about, how it's the warmest or the second warmest or the third warmest. It's the drumbeat of the Anthropocene.
A drumbeat which is getting faster. A report from NASA today says 2019 was the second hottest year on record, second only to 2016. The report reminds us of the scale of the crisis ahead. Both the past 5 years and the past decade are the hottest in a century and a half. Like frogs in a jar, we are slowly boiling.
What we find is that all of the trends in the last 100 years are actually due to human activity. If our activity had not been there, we would not have warmed anything like what we have indeed warmed.
Over the decades, governments have had to try and devise more imaginative solutions to deal with extreme weather, but nothing by comparison to this new challenge at hand.
Even to keep carbon dioxide levels at the constant at the where they are would require cuts of around 60 to 70% in carbon dioxide emissions, and would have to come down even further below that to actually cause the temperature to stop rising.
Britain wouldn't be immune from the effects of climate change. Under the most perilous projections, the Thames barrier would likely be overwhelmed. Large parts of central London would become uninhabitable. 1.5 million people could lose their homes, and the most economically productive part of the United Kingdom would be completely lost.
Naturally, attention has turned to what the British contribution should be. The government is committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But in these earliest days of Boris Johnson's new government, in the eyes of some, they've failed their first test in saving Flybe and bailing out domestic flights in the name of growth in the regions.
Matt Hancock, we face a climate catastrophe. Should we be flying less?
No. We should use technology to reduce carbon emissions. For instance, electric planes are a potential in the not-too-distant future.
This is an oft-repeated trope from the government, that technology is the answer, but in many cases it's too far off to make a difference.
Aviation is one of those areas where the technology in principle is there. There have been some trials of things like using biofuels, fuels from plants, or for electrification at a very early stage. But actually most experts you talk to will say we're not really expecting it to make a big impact till at least the 2040s. And the big issue is that will only have an impact perhaps on short to medium haul flights.
In any case, Britain's contribution is relatively nugatory. In fairness to Britain's governments, our emissions have been falling over the past 3 decades, but global emissions have more than risen to compensate. In that context, politicians are unlikely to ask their voters to shoulder pain for no obvious benefit, especially this government with its new, particular and peculiar coalition.
The result of the election means there has rarely been a time where urban environmentalist voters has mattered less to the Conservative Party's fortunes. Instead, their new unlikely electoral alliance consists of free marketeers and more economically statist Northern Midlands working class voters. That might be a difficult alliance to maintain. Something, though, which might come to unite them is a distaste for onerous environmental regulations. For them, keeping the economy moving will always trump environmental concerns.
The technological and political barriers in the government's way are thus profound. Can they and other democracies marry electoral success and protecting our planet for voters not yet born? It will be one of the defining questions of this century.
I'm joined now by Chris Stark, the Chief Executive of government advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change. They recommended the 2050 carbon neutral target, which was adopted by Theresa May, and by Kelly Beaver, Managing Director of Public Affairs at the polling firm IpsosMORI. Good evening to you both. Kelly, if I could start with you. What are the splits in who cares about climate change? Because we have seen this go up the public agenda.
Yeah, indeed. So there's no denying that the public are more concerned about climate change and the environment than they have been than the last 20 years. But the way that breaks down actually by region, socioeconomic class, gender and age is quite interesting. So we do have more females than men saying that they're worried about the environment and climate change, more in the socioeconomic categories that are considered to be the higher socioeconomic categories like A and B, but also people in South East and London more concerned than they are in the regions. 22% in London compared to 16% in the Midlands, and a similar sort of percentage up further north.
Well, it's interesting to hear that breakdown. And how does it come out when you look at what people want to do about it and the actions they want to take?
Indeed. So public and the actions ultimately government is who they think should be taking a lot of the key actions around climate change, not necessarily corporates as much and not necessarily themselves. The kind of actions that they endorse are things that are largely around levying corporates in order to be more corporate environmentally sustainable, but also putting taxes on products which have plastic packaging, etc. When you ask them about the willingness to either put up with something that will have a cost to them or not have a good impact on their comfort, people are much less likely to agree with it.
Well, which is why, if I bring you in at this point, Chris, some people today were surprised that a government which has pledged for the UK to be carbon neutral by 2050 has cut back on, saying we don't need to cut back on flights and also cut back on passenger duty. How does that work together?
Well, I think this is a really interesting moment for the government, as we've just heard in the piece, actually. The climate was a big issue in the election. It wasn't the top issue. But the government was elected on that pledge. At the end of this year, we have this global climate summit. And, and certainly my view is that is a moment for the UK to demonstrate real leadership on the issue of climate change. And here we are in 2020. There will be a series of these climate tests. And this is the first of them. I mean, we don't quite know what was agreed this week on the Flybe rescue deal.
Well, we do know they've suspended, and they're going to suspend, passenger duty in order to alleviate the problem for the airline so they can keep trading.
Well, we don't precisely know what they're going to do with passenger duty, but I agree if that is the outcome, if there has been a cut in air passenger duty, that is not in line with the kind of climate strategy that the government will need to demonstrate that leadership on at the end of the year.
So the first test, they failed?
Well, I think they haven't failed it yet. I think the crucial thing is if you're going to address this issue of climate change, it's not going to be about one step here, one step there. There's a package of things.
A series of tests, and I suppose when people are talking about they'd like the government to levy taxes, they don't want them to cut taxes, that is a test in this first instance that has failed.
I don't want to say they failed it. I do want to say that it doesn't look good. So, as we progress, it will have to improve.
So it doesn't look good because, of course, it could have been a bolder statement today to not have supported Flybe and also to have redirected any investment into perhaps rail and actually that infrastructure.
Well, I quite agree. I mean, I think that the one crumb of comfort in this is that there was a reference to climate change in the government statement. So we look to the budget now to understand exactly what that means. Yes. But as you say, that decision in isolation doesn't look like it's part of a sensible package overall. The crucial thing is, what is that plan? Because it's not going to be solved by one strategy for aviation. It's going to be solved by a strategy on all sectors. And the crucial thing for us, at least, is that we understand in some detail the steps that need to be taken to get to the goal that's now been set by Parliament. Those are outcomes, though. We can express that, but what we don't know is the policies that will drive to that.
And what do people have to do now? How radical do people have to be to hit this target? Because they don't want to do it necessarily, but what do they have to do? Well,
I don't think they do need to be radical, and I think this is important. I mean, at change, yes, pain, no. And it's interesting, referring to just what we've heard, that people do look to the government for the leadership on this, and I think that's right. The government will have to put together the plan that points to how we will get to that net zero goal overall. We don't have that right now. We might understand some of the components of it. What we haven't seen is the proper pledge from the government with the right policies in place and the right commitments. That, I think, can stand the test of public opinion at the end of that.
You have to bring the whole country with you on that.
Well, I agree.
Can you give some examples of what might need to change? It might not be radical, but what do individuals need to do, even if it's the government leading them there? Well,
if we look back to the advice that we gave to the government last year that led to the government setting and laying the new target in Parliament last year, what we pointed to was a world in 2050 when we've reached that net zero goal. Now, interestingly, that doesn't look like a radically different world. We are still driving vehicles on roads, we are still warm in our homes, we still have jobs, but everything has changed along the way. And this is the point, is that the government needs to present the plan for how we get to that. Individuals themselves, and certainly individually, can have very little purchase on that overall mission. But I think, interestingly, if we all start the discussion properly about how those lifestyles will change over the preceding 3 decades, that's something that the government can use to make proper policies. I think there's a great deal about this that we don't understand. We understand the outcomes rather than the public preference for the things that would lead to those outcomes.
So are you saying we're going to have electric vehicles and they'll all be electric by that point? Are you saying that all our homes will be insulated and that's being done either through government subsidy or individual investment? Are these some of the changes?
Absolutely. Let's pick out just a few of those things. So at the moment, the biggest single sector for greenhouse gas emissions in the UK is transport. And if we look at that sector, we can point to actually quite an achievable goal of phasing phasing out the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles on our roads. At the moment, the government has an ambition to do that by 2040. That is too late. We need to see that brought forward, preferably to something like 2030. Looking at the biggest, I think the biggest challenge overall is how we heat ourselves. We are completely dependent on fossil fuels for that. Over 30 years, you can make a plan to move to some of the alternatives that have clean sources of heat for homes and buildings up and down the country. Think of this, 30 million buildings, 30 years to do it. So that's a measure of the size of the challenge. I think the interesting thing for me is that what we've learned in the time since we've had the Climate Change Act, which is steering all of this at the moment, is that it's actually possible to do this. We understand in some detail how to do it overall. But we haven't got the policy in place to do it.
Wait for the policy and these tests today. I suppose the first one is what people are looking at. Thank you for joining us.